Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel at Historical Materialism Montreal, The Great Transition. I'm David McNally. I teach history at the University of Houston, and I'm an editor of Spectre Journal, which is sponsoring this discussion today. For those of you who haven't checked it out, you can find Spectre Journal at spectrejournal.com. And if you hurry in and get your subscription, you might still get the current issue with the lead article by Robin Kelly on policing and racial capitalism. But the next issue coming soon includes coverage on class struggle and racial justice after the union drive at Amazon, race, class, and Brexit in Britain, eco-socialism, and lots more. Our discussion today is on knowledge production and cultures of resistance, new perspectives in historical materialist research. And the spirit of this discussion is, in the first instance, a critical and reflective one. That is to say, it begins from the premise that there is no such thing as the historical materialist method, singular. The assumption for the conversation is that historical materialist research must be methodologically, theoretically, politically responsive to the object of study, and must decipher the ways in which the actual object of investigation and exploration requires certain methods, protocols, and so on, and that these will often be highly experimental in character. That's, I think, perhaps a Brechtian moment in the kind of approach that we're discussing today, that experimentation rather than the application of preformed formulae is very much in the spirit of critical historical materialist research. And this is certainly true for both of the texts that we're talking about today, and at least how I read both of the authors. Now, one of the authors once said to me, I don't know if I'm doing historical materialist research. And I said back to them, well, I think you are, but you are not doing so in a formulaic way. You are taking certain protocols of historical materialism, in particular, the idea that all serious research into social and political phenomena is going to attend to the ways in which people engage in a variety of human productive creative activities through which they produce and reproduce their lives multidimensionally. And I think both of these texts and their authors share that commitment. The two texts we're talking about are Elleni Zeleke's Ethiopia in Theory, Revolution and Knowledge Production, 1964 to 2016, published in the Historical Materialism book series with Brill, and now out in paperback with Haymarket, and Aaron Kamugisha's Beyond Coloniality, Citizenship and Freedom in the Caribbean Intellectual Tradition, out with Indiana University Press also in 2019. Santim is a professor in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University, and Aaron is professor of Caribbean and Africana Studies at the University of the West Indies. Santim's book, Ethiopia in Theory, tries to think through African knowledge production with respect to the revolutionary students movement in Ethiopia and the Ethiopian diaspora. Aaron's book is grappling with problems of freedom and citizenship in the post-colonial Caribbean, and he selects two primary interlocutors, CLR James and Sylvia Wynter. So that's just to give those of you who are not yet familiar with their texts, shame on you, you need to read them soon, some idea. So we're dealing with knowledge production, cultural production, dissident and radical intellectual traditions, and their relation to specific social and political sites. So let's start there. And the first thing I really want to put to both of you, Santim and Aaron, is that your methods, your approaches are highly multi-genre or interdisciplinary. You range across social history, political economy, literary text, autoethnography, and more. And yet the reader feels like there's a sort of unitary explanatory framework that each of you is developing. So, Santim, let's start with you. Can you make some sense for us of this sort of interdisciplinary approach?
Sure. I mean, let me just start by saying that I think what my book is primarily interested in is the ways in which ideas and theory actually become part of a lived experience. And so I am posing the question of how student intellectuals in Ethiopia become vectors of revolutionary theory. But I think it comes back to what you were saying. I'm not interested in a kind of a priori account of how that theory is going to play out in the Ethiopian context. So how does, they're mobilizing Marxist theory in order to understand their situation in Ethiopia. But I don't want to give an a priori account of of the meaning of that theory. I'm interested in how that theory becomes, part of political practice in Ethiopia. In order to understand that, you actually have to pay attention to practice and what's going on politically. And so I think for me, the method is trying to trace the ways in which ideas get deployed in a particular situation, how people articulate those ideas, the kinds of questions they ask, why they're asking those questions, how it shapes political discourse, and how political discourse then reshapes the questions that the students are asking. So in order to attend to the social life of theory, I actually need to develop a method that can actually trace that social life rather than, again, giving this sort of a priori account. So what is theory for me then is an attempt to kind of systematize these multiple ways in which ideas are playing out in an actual, historical context. So let me just say that now. Is that good enough for?
Absolutely.
All right.
We will definitely riff off of that. Aaron,
all right.
over to you, Aaron.
Yes, certainly. And let me start by saying thank you very much to David from both of us.
Sorry, I'm very rude. My protocol is not, I'm not well trained.
We're not formal because I think that we are dating ourselves now, but I mean, we have all known each other for almost 20 years at this point, okay? So the team and I, for the audience, entered the social and political thought program at the same time, in the same year. So we've known each other for a long period of time. So thanks to David for putting this together, and it's great to be at Historical Materialism Conference for the first time. And in response to your question, David, I think that the problematic I was trying to uncover necessitated the method that I was going to take. So what I was really concerned with at the beginning of the project was the contentment of the post-Grenada Revolution Anglophone Caribbean with neocolonial relations of power, and the questions of what this actually meant for citizenship within the Anglophone Caribbean. The intensity of neocolonial citizenship within the Caribbean, the withering away of radical alternatives, was something that captivated me and really led me to the Caribbean radical and the Black radical traditions. Simultaneously, though, in reading those traditions, I knew I wanted to mobilize Caribbean theory as a solution to Caribbean problems, and I realized it was also a fantastic archive for doing so. So I particularly took two thinkers, even though many are mobilized in the text, C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter, and I worked with those two thinkers towards both a critique of the Caribbean present, but also as a way of gesturing towards an embattled future beyond coloniality. And a whole armada of other Caribbean thinkers came into the play. So there was a way then that the interdisciplinary nature of the work was necessitated by the Caribbean anti-colonial radical tradition, where the battlefield is human life writ large rather than a particular disciplinary orientation. And certainly many of the major Caribbean thinkers have been fundamentally multidisciplinary in the work they have done. C.L.R. James's first book, for example, was a novel, Minty Alley. M.A. Césaire, we think of him as a poet, political theorist. Marty, the essayist, political theorist, Camel Brathwaite, the cultural critic, also the poet. So there have often been, when you look at the Caribbean and the Black radical traditions, fundamental contributions that major thinkers have made in what we would consider in the Western Academy to be different fields of engagement. And if you're going to really engage with those thinkers, you have to take this work in concert. You can't just take one single part of it. So that became the interest and the appetite for what I was going to do in Beyond Coloniality.
Okay, so you've already framed in some ways for me my next question to each of you, because part of this multi-genre or interdisciplinary approach is that each of you have fairly sustained meditations on a number of novels and literary texts in your work. And in fact, each of you introduced me to some that I didn't know. Santim, I'm thinking particularly Beneath the Lion's Gaze is one that figures prominently, How to Read the Air. And Aaron, as you say, you've got multiple, and interestingly, it strikes me that at a number of key junctures, novels by George Lamming figure very centrally. You end up with a discussion very near the end around his novel, The Pleasures of Exile. So could each of you talk a little bit about the ways in which you're working with literary texts as you engage social and political questions? So again, Santim. And you're still muted.
Yes. So I think, one of the questions that was important for me in writing this book was the question of what it means to do sort of social science in Africa and the problem of social sciences in Africa, and the ways in which the social science assumes that perhaps you are a kind of abstract citizen, shorn of your obligations that are might political and social obligations, your kinship obligations, your obligations that come through perhaps like ethnicity or other sort of communal sort of identities and so on. So I actually was really interested in if you're not this kind of abstracted, individual that maybe is, the result of capitalist processes in Europe and North America, what does it mean to actually write from a position where you can't speak about yourself as an abstract author? Am I making sense to you here? Where that position of neutrality is really hard to maintain. Like you're not an abstract author speaking to other abstracted individuals. Do you know what I'm saying? And so I think the question of method for me was also the question of the problem of the neutral social science writer who goes into a space and thinks that they're having this kind of rational conversation between abstract individuals. And so the idea of engaging, again, the ways in which ideas have a social life means that I need to engage poetry, I need to engage novels, I engage song as well, in order to really think about the social life of the student movement and the ideas that they produced and the way it became part of Ethiopian society. So poetics is really important for my book, I think, and poetics in terms of perhaps new beginnings is the idea of poetics as kind of bringing something new into the world, but also poetics as a way to think differently than the ways in which I've been trained as a social scientist, right? Because of this problem that I've already articulated. I could talk more about the idea of Tizita as well, because I think Tizita is really framing my book. Perhaps we can go to Aaron, and then I can come back and talk a bit more about Tizita, or I can talk about the novels, either one. But I feel like I've already talked quite a bit. So let me go to Aaron. Let me defer to my colleague here.
And we'll come back to Tizita, though. I think that's a great idea.
Very much so. Yes. And let me say that my interest in also mobilizing novels have, for many of us, I mean, I came to a love of the study of ideas through literature. Okay, so that was always, there in me. But of course, I didn't have to take that particular route in this particular project. But I would say that the influence of being at York, okay, in the multidisciplinary nature of York was important, especially encountering one course, which I did not do because I was a graduate student rather than undergraduate, but that was taught by one of my mentors at York University, the very great Fanon scholar Ascetic. So Ascetic had a course called Social and Political Thought in Caribbean and African Literature. And I was a collector of course outlines. I loved, I still have a whole stack of them and, scanned and that kind of stuff, because I'm just so fascinated at how people assemble and what they try to teach. And that course by Ascetic, I mean, sometimes you've seen a course in which you just wished you could have done, but I mean, he had the students reading Marx and reading Hegel and reading Fanon and reading Tsidangaremba and reading Bessie Head and reading Simone Schwartz-Bart, I can't remember the full list, but that kind of method and that kind of way of doing things I found captivating and was actually very important in terms of the assembly of how one can bring together texts which persons might find belong to different fields. But more directly to my project, I've thought for a long time that the theory is in the literature in some very important ways, especially when one looks at the Caribbean intellectual tradition. Because if you examine the work of the great 1960s writers of the Caribbean, in many ways, in their novels, in their poetry, they are writing social and political thought, but they're also trying to prepare Caribbean people for the dilemma of citizenship within the post-colonial state. And there are the renderings of this are extremely compelling, okay? And they're full of social and political significance and philosophical insight. So as somebody who's not trained in literature, I found the ideas that were coming through and threaded through them very powerful. So there's then a kind of drama and a distillation of ideas in this great literature that I found compelling, especially for a project I was doing. In other words, trying to give intimations towards what beyond coloniality could be within the Anglophone Caribbean. And when one takes some examples from a couple of the writers, so you take up Martin Carter, for example. Martin Carter, part of Jagan's 1953 government, which, as we know, is forestalled, first communist government in the Western Hemisphere, forestalled by British imperialism, in conjunction with the Americans. He's thrown into prison with many of the others. And he writes a set of poems, and particularly one from that time, I Come from the Nigger Yard, okay? And a passage of I Come from the Nigger Yard goes as follows. I come from the nigger yard, leaping from the oppressor's hate and the scorn of myself. And I think that even that line, that idea of the scorn of myself, touches something about the nature of coloniality that is not easily apprehended within standard Marxist discourse, okay? But it's also a nature of that kind of ascetic anti-colonialism, okay? Wedded by someone who is a committed Marxist, which is part of one of the most, part of this compelling intellectual tradition, which I'm trying to track and I'm trying to engage with within my book.
Okay, and because you close there on tradition, which raises all those issues of memory and belonging and so on, Santim, I think you better continue.
All right. So Tizita is an animating concept in my book. Tizita is the word, it means memory or nostalgia. It's also a genre of music, so it's a song form. It can also refer to a musical scale, and so Tizita becomes this way for me to think about the past and the relationship between the past and the present. And one of the reasons why I really needed to think about that is that I really needed to think about multiple temporalities and the ways in which history is sedimented into the present, right? And I think I wanted to do that because so much of the way in which revolutions are talked about is in this overly empiricist sort of framework. But also, I think that David Scott's work on sort of the Grenadian Revolution actually has had an outsized effect in terms of the ways in which people have been talking about revolution in the global South. And he has this idea that you can talk about revolution through this framework of the problem space. And so there's a problem space where the people that you are looking at have come up with a set of answers to a set of questions that they had posed, and the work of the historian then is to think about those questions and to discover those questions again, but also to show the ways in which those questions in the past are different from our present. So it really marks periods off as quite separate from each other, and it marks a sharp division between past, present, and future. And one of the things I wanted to capture in my own work is the ways in which the past is always coming up in unexpected ways in the present, and also the ways in which the present is a sedimentation of all kinds of past efforts and continues to live with us in sort of unexpected ways. And it seems to me that Tizita as a song form, does try to capture the ways in which we live with the past in this complicated way, and the ways in which we need to write about the past in this complicated way, and these multiple valences. A typical kind of Tizita's songs are also always about lost love. And a classic Tizita song was recorded by a very popular Ethiopian musician, Mahmoud Ahmed, just at the beginning of the revolution. It's a 13-minute song, and it's a lament about lost love. And it goes, typical lines in the song can be something like, I don't, something like, my Tizita is you, I don't have Tizita, you say you are coming, yet you never do. So my memory is you, I don't have memory, you say you're coming, yet you never do. So the thing about Tizita is it's always referring to the form and loss of form, as well as the loss of content and the relationship between the two. And so the way it's always asking us to question the ways in which the past comes down to us in the present. Another typical sort of set of lyrics within Mahmoud's Tizita song that he recorded just at the beginning of the revolution in 1974 it goes something like this: outdoing yesterday, shouldering on today, borrowing from tomorrow, renewing yesteryears, comes Tizita, hauling possessions. So I think that Tizita is really, again, trying to tell us about how the memory of the past overwhelms the container that holds that memory. It instructs us to think again about the genres and forms through which the past has come down to us as an inheritance. It suggests that there's a gap between living with the past and inheriting the past, but also the ways in which the past explodes in uncanny ways into the present, and that the ways in which our relationship to the past and present is uncontrollable to some degree and unpredictable, right? And that is part of the method that I try to adopt in the way that I write about the Ethiopian revolution. I'm not trying to necessarily be this like hardcore expert. I'm trying to actually live in the space of Tizita. That's my method. And so I think that's also important for me because I don't want to be an expert on the revolution. And there's something about something about a democratic way of writing that was important to me too. And adopting Tizita as a method becomes a way of thinking with people rather than thinking, about or thinking over people, like in a top-down fashion. So that's what Tizita is also doing for me, I think. let me just stop there.
Oh,
Chatting away. Huh?
No, that's great. And if time permits, I want to come back to this question of the democratic way of writing.
Right. And I will say, I just want to point this out because I spent the morning listening to a song that's 16 minutes long that just came out in Ethiopia called Sus 3. And it's 3 songs in one. And it's, of course, like it's the power of the Trinity, right? Because, you know, this Coptic tradition really shapes contemporary discourses. But that song is so different from Tizita and the method of Tizita because it's a kind of leap into the past where we just can grab our kings and queens and talk about the glory of you know, some kind of lost Ethiopia. And Tizita is really doing something different because it's questioning form, it's questioning the way that we have access to the past. It doesn't just take that leap into the past and grab it and create this glorious history. And so I really was trying to avoid that method of talking. But I think it's interesting that such a song like Sos, this 3-in-1 song, would come out today. It really speaks to a different structure of feeling about politics that exists in the Horn of Africa at the moment. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Okay. So what you said, though, clearly, I think, gestures towards the ways in which at a, you know, kind of certain moment in very early part of your text, you turn to and engage with Raymond Williams' concept of structures of feeling. And interestingly, Aaron, you do too. You also mention Williams in this regard. I'm not interested. Yeah, I'm not interested in the particular references that either of you make. Okay. But what I'm interested in is that sense of the affective dimension of social and political life that I think both of you are trying to engage with. There's a sense when I read both of your works that these are not clinical pieces of political science type analysis. These are much more wide-ranging and multidimensional because there's a sense, I feel, in which you do want to get at the ways in which societal organization and political life is lived, a certain kind of everydayness to politics and its sites. And so, irrespective, Aaron, of whether you remember the Raymond Williams reference, this idea that you're also addressing sensibilities and affective dimensions. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would say that I am in a particular manner. In other words, I've been fascinated for the last decade of trying to figure out in a number of different projects what we might call a Caribbean method, what constitutes Caribbean thought, what is the nature of the Caribbean intellectual tradition. And certainly I'm not the only person who's been writing or thinking on that. And there have been some brilliant rejoinders on that. The very fine literary critic Gordon Roller has a lovely essay called Articulating a Caribbean Ascetic Towards a Revolution in Self-Perception. And I mean, it was an essay published at the end of the 1970s, and he's really trying to chart from the time of slavery to the period of the 1970s, the major moments within a Caribbean ascetic. But I will always remember the last part, seemingly so prophetic since it was being written in 1979. He talks about the bleakness of vision of the late 1970s, and he says, all the West Indian poets, okay, and he counts Lamming, Walcott, Brathwaite, etc., are furiously driven men, driven by the quality of chaos that is present in the contemporary Caribbean. And I mean, it's an incredible line. And certainly he's right when you actually read their work and what their work is actually trying to say at that time, the kind of urgency and the passion and the nature. But I certainly think that there is something about a certain question of social living within very small societies, okay? Societies in which kinship groups and friendship groups are very close. That many Caribbean thinkers are trying to uncover. How do we then think about the intimacy of tyranny and the tyranny of intimacy within spaces which are like that? I mean, I always remember a Guyanese thinker, a major Guyanese thinker, telling me, I asked him, how is it that you were not targeted by Burnham? You know, I mean, I thought that you would be one of the persons who were targeted for liquidation by Burnham. And he said, yes, you know, but the thing is that my mother went to Burnham and begged for my life and reminded Burnham that he was my godfather. I could not believe it. Okay, but it was the truth, and it's the nature of the smallness of this space. So certainly, I think in terms of structures of feeling, a lot of it comes down to that particular notion of an anti-colonial ascetic tradition in which the range and focus also is not the specific societies, but the entire world. Because even what we consider or we constitute or we name as the Caribbean has to consider the fact that so much Caribbean intellectual production and radical activity has taken place within the diaspora rather than within the islands, okay? So the Caribbean and Caribbean thought and Caribbean structures of feeling are always implicated in wider worldly diasporic formations, while at the same time, there's often that kernel of interest within the Caribbean at their heart. So it's a large and kind of complex question. Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Santim.
Sure. I mean, so I think that I turn to Raymond Williams and this notion of emerging, I guess, modes of feeling the world, because he is trying to capture the ways in which the social is constantly changing. But I also think that I was really interested in talking about emotion and feelings as part of the social life of the revolution as well, right? And again, part of my interest in doing that is this question of what does it mean to be an intellectual, right? And if the intellectual, again, is not this like abstract individual talking to abstract individuals, who is the intellectual and what does it mean to write about a people or about a situation? And so I actually start my book by talking about myself and my body and the memories that I have of the revolution and how it comes down to me as a past that haunts me. And that is part of the kind, again, the sort of social life of this revolution. But I also then think about the body as a set of relationships. So the body not as a contained, thing with like, barriers, right? Like that the body actually is not a discrete entity, it's a set of relationships. And if it is a set of relationships, then I'm not just, when I'm talking about my positionality, I also have to talk about this sedimented history and relationships that constitute like me and my voice and my body, right? And so I think that starting with my body and starting with this set of like, feelings and emotions was actually a way of disinvesting from what could be taken as a kind of particular ethnic identity and so on, and to move out from that and to actually think more widely about what constitutes the present in a sense, right? So I really did want to start from the body and from emotion and then move out from there and to think about feeling as part of social processes as well, rather than seeing feelings as something that is outside, that's personal, that can be reduced to that, right? Actually feeling in the body as a place to start asking questions, right? That then lead out to something wider. And I suppose like in the context of Ethiopia and the civil war that started in November, I think my method is even more important in a sense, right? Because there's all these people taking positions from a very sectarian point of view, right? I am this, I am that, from like a very, like a position of communal identities that somehow can be separated from other people. And I don't want to deny those communal identities, but I also want to think about those communal identities as part of layered processes and in relationship to other people and groups and so on. So I think my method is also about how do I position myself in a very complex social history, and hold myself accountable, but also not get stuck in some kind of just personal story as well. So it's a way of disinvesting from the personal on some level. Okay, I'll stop there. Huh?
If I may jump in here, because I think that Sontim is far more engaging and brilliant in using this method than I am. But it's funny because you're reminding me of the first sentence of my book, which I had personalized, but then I was suggested that I change it, but it reads as follows. The contemporary Caribbean, an area of experience that so many of its dispossessed citizens have given their lives and hearts to in the hope of social transformation, is in a state of tragedy and crisis, destroyed and corrupted by a post-colonial malaise wedded to neocolonialism. Okay, and originally I had basically have given our lives and hearts to in the hope of social transformation, but then it was kind of changed to there, and then I kind of kept it at there, and and stuff. But yeah, I mean, certainly what I was trying to do in my book was also a very deeply felt, project. Even though I ruled that I wasn't as daring and as daring in a very I'll just use the word good for now, a very good manner, as Sontim was, if she had published her book a little before me, then perhaps my book would have been a better book.
I mean, I actually, in retrospect, feel I could have gone much further with my method. I also felt like I needed to tame the ways in which I was engaging with this Tizita method. And I was, editors constantly were saying to me that I had two books. One was about the Ethiopian Revolution, and the other one was about social science knowledge production in Africa. And I was like, no, you have to understand that, I can't talk about the Ethiopian Revolution unless I think about this idea of the social life of theory. I'm not just trying to give a kind of empiricist account of this revolution. Other people have done that before. But the question is, how do we actually really talk about the ways in which we live with this revolution and its ideas and the way it shaped society? And I feel like I would say that my book is one of the first books that I think takes that question more seriously, rather than, I guess, talking about the Ethiopian Revolution within a schema that we all already know, and then the Ethiopian Revolution just becomes another example or another iteration of a schema about how revolutions operate and how they repeat themselves in some ways. Starting from France, and then Ethiopia maybe is the last place that has a revolution, and is finally catching up with the rest of the world, right? So I really needed to find a method as well to not just repeat that kind of schema or that kind of telos. Yeah.
And it's fascinating when you speak about the difficulty then of explaining your project to other people. I mean, yes, it may have been that I wasn't describing it very well. I was a little inchoate, but I found a similar difficulty in terms of, it was so difficult for people to understand that I'm taking two major Caribbean and global radical thinkers, and I'm using them to think through the conundrums of a contemporary Caribbean, but it's a work on their thought, but it's also a work on the nature of the Caribbean state after 50 years of petty bourgeois aggrandizement and neocolonialism, which we have decided to call it independence, flag independence. But this was just so strange for people because they're there, but you're either doing a work on like post-colonial Caribbean citizenship, or you're basically doing a work on Caribbean thought and a thinker, and I'm there, no, I'm not doing either. And that's one of the reasons why I assembled so many thinkers and I had them speak in going back and forth in the text, because chapter 4 is on James, 5 is on Winter, but James and Winter make appearances in the first 3 chapters before then I do a grand reading of them, you know? So you're thinking about James and Winter throughout the text before you actually have the moments in which you are focusing on James and Winter. Somehow I think that if I had chosen Gramsci or Foucault, people would have had such a difficulty understanding what I was trying to do. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right, but then if one was to write about Foucault in Ethiopia or just Marx in Ethiopia without really thinking about how Marx is part of the social life of theory, then what are you actually writing about?
Precisely.
So,
Yeah, exactly.
So, and
yeah.
And so for me, what became really important is to posit the students that I'm looking at as producers of Marxist theory, not just as in a derivative fashion, but actually making their own ideas, right? And that it's not just a question of you know, I use the term they appropriate Marxist theory. I'm not even sure that's the correct term anymore, to be honest, because I think they're just, you know, they're engaging Marxism and creating their own theory. Like it's not even a question of appropriation. And why does Germany, in a sense, have to be the center of Marxist theory? Like, why can't various places in the global South also be seen as the center of Marxist theory? What would it mean to take that more seriously, I guess, is one of the questions that my book is posing, right? Again, not as a derivative discourse, but as something that is original in some ways, right? Yeah. Sorry, David.
No, I don't think
that's all good, and it circles me back to a formulation you made earlier, Santim, that I'd like both of you to engage a little bit. You described a democratic way of writing, and you know, I think both of you share a kind of commitment in that direction, despite the, you know, quite different contexts and objects of study. And Aaron, you know, listening to you just a moment ago, it seemed to me that one of the ways in which you, in a certain sense, democratized your text was, in fact, to make it so polyvalent, to make it a, you know, Bakhtin uses the term a polyphonic novel. That you just open it up to this growing multiplicity of voices. And at times reading your text, Aaron, I felt like, yeah, I've got to keep track here, because we've got novelists, we've got theorists, we've got playwrights. You've now brought in a Jamaican political scientist into the conversation and so on. But it does seem to me that there's a sense in which both of your texts avoid that kind of monological commentary. They're dialogical texts in a certain sense. So, you know, talk to me a little bit about the ways in which that was deliberate, or the ways in which you're just seeing that now about them.
Aaron, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll start off at least. Well, I know, you know, you have these one-line things that you say to people when they ask you what your text is about. I think one thing I came up to towards the end of the project, I said, well, one of the things I'm trying to do is intellectual history of attempts to decolonize neocolonial citizenship within the Anglophone Caribbean. Okay? And really, I'm not doing that, because I think if I was doing an intellectual history, it would be far more structured in a particular type of way. But I gave them that as a line that they could understand why I'm bringing in so many of the people are just referencing them sometimes and putting them there, you know? So especially at a particular point in chapter 2, I deliberately do it in a somewhat dizzying way when I'm talking about Jamaica and I'm talking about clientelism, you know? And I'm saying, you know, Carlene Eddy will say that this is just democracy by default, you know, what is happening in Jamaica under clientelism. Carl Stone will call it this, you know? I mean, I'm going back and forth and just referencing them just so that people can see the kind of agonies and the concerns that a generation of Caribbean social and political theorists have consistently had with this moment, this kind of neocolonialism which refuses to lie down and be still. Okay, so there is a way in which I am mobilizing a number of thinkers in order to try to perform that work of showing a kind of thick description of the constant way in which the best work within the field has had to come back to these relations of domination. And the best work in the field with sometimes some quite different ideological persuasions, from quite liberal nationalists to sincere and very thoroughgoing Marxists have come back to the nature of the deep flaws within the construction of post-colonial citizenship, which of course one would expect under capitalism. These are not a surprise because these are parts of the historical tendencies of bourgeois, accumulation within the colony. So we shouldn't be surprised at what we're actually getting in terms of the Black Anglo-Saxons and the ways in which the kind of complicity of middle-class betrayal within the Anglophone Caribbean. This is to be expected, okay? This is what is going to happen. But what have been the kind of fights around this? What have been the debates around this? Particularly since there is a fascinating way in which the memory of these events and the memories even of these dialogues just seems to vanish after they have been made. Okay.
Santine, would you like to come back on that democratic way of writing issue?
Sure. I mean, I think that my book, it's actually started off with the 2005 election in Ethiopia. And I was like, on the one hand, that election was supposed to be seen as a kind of benchmark for the first time in which, a real democratic election was being held. On the other hand, it led to a very complicated and contested political process. One where terms like authoritarian were being used to describe various players, etc. And I was like, I need to make sense of this election. I need to make sense of Ethiopian politics. And the language of political science absolutely did not help me make sense of this election and who was contesting what and the histories that shape the political questions that inform the actions of different sort of constituencies within that election. And I think that the project really began with, why can't anybody make sense of this election? Why isn't anybody saying anything sensible? And I was like, how can there be like entire disciplines of African studies or African political science and they still have nothing really of quality to say about an election process in Africa? So I think that the question of like, how do I talk about democracy and how do I even develop a method to think about this in ways that matter to me as somebody who's implicated in Ethiopia, who has relatives there, who spends a lot of time in Ethiopia, and not just making sense of a situation so that I can write a report for a fancy NGO or something, right? So the method really is about struggling to make sense of a democratic process, what democracy means, what happened to an emancipatory project that was started by the students in Ethiopia, how to make sense of the fact that I don't think that project was lost in 2005. It still had valence. It still has valence. So how do we think about all of that history? And I really was trying to think with people rather than think above people or against people. Like I was like, I feel implicated in this place, and let me talk about those implications. And that's why I start with the personal and my body, and then really try to develop a method so that I can have conversations, people that I know and I care about, etc. So yeah.
Great.
I'll stop there.
That's very good. Now, Santine, you said earlier, why do we need to center Germany? I thought that was a very good point. And so I want to center something completely different and throw it out to both of you and see if it resonates at all. And it has to do with your reflections on the current conjunctures in each of the locales and regions that you're reflecting on. Because I've been in conversation with the people who have produced a volume called Arab Marxism and National Liberation, Selected Writings of Mahdi Emel. And Mahdi Emel, being based in Lebanon, is really having to grapple with the problem of sectarianism. And he knows that if you begin with some commonsensical notion of ethnicity, you understand nothing. He wants to understand sectarianism not as something that originates in some abstraction called ethnicity, but in a very particular historical process within the wider social formation. And he essentially says, look, sectarianism in Lebanon has to do with an enduring crisis of hegemony. There is no social class from above that can create any kind of unitary, unifying social and political project. Sorry about that. And as a result, all they can do is substitute sectarian organization for this crisis. And this is why it can only be resolved from below. It cannot be resolved from above. It will only be sectarianism from above. So just we're centering Mahdi Amel and an Arab Marxist for the moment, and speak to me about the ways in which that does or doesn't resonate with the context each of you is examining.
I mean, I'll just jump in right now, and I really think though that we need to think about sectarianism. Like, I think the way that we talk about sectarianism or communal identities in Africa and the Middle East is as if it's a kind of mask for something that is more true or authentic or something. And I do think that we need to stay away from that kind of language. I do think that sectarianism or communal identities, or in Ethiopia, the nationalities question, because that's how communal identities get talked about, is through the nationalities question, is also a reflection of actual social processes. It's a way for people to politicize geography in the country. It's a way for them to talk about how resource distribution is differentiated across regions or language groups. And so it's not just a kind of top-down process or a set of, it's not just an invented identity. It is an attempt to actually articulate something that is real on the ground. And I think people need to actually pay attention to that, that those identities and those sectarian solidarities or communal. And I think Fadi Bardawel in his book on Lebanon actually talks a lot about this, right? That sectarianism is also a process that is bottom up, not just top down, right? And is an attempt to articulate something about, I guess, the way in which the nation state is a problem because it doesn't have this hegemonic project, but at the same time, we don't want to think about these ethnic identities as simply invented or because I think, if I think about somebody like Mahmoud Mamdani's work more recently, or other folks, they really are talking about the problem of ethnicity or the problem of the nationalities question as this problem that, we need to, it's a veil that needs to be taken away. And I don't know what we get after that. Do we get just individuals, the abstract individual relating to other abstract individuals? That's not a reality, right? So how do you take seriously the social processes that create differentiation in these places too, right? And that communal identities are part of the process of addressing that and are part of a bottom-up process too. Okay, I kind of answered your question, but I also went in a different direction.
Yeah, and you segued a little bit, which was good. Aaron.
I'm going with what Santim said just now. I mean, I was thinking particularly from the space that I'm most familiar with and I do the most scholarship on, of the questions in Trinidad and Guyana, in which the questions of ethnicity, ethnic rivalry, the cultural constitution of citizenship have been debated tenaciously decade after decade after decade without any clear sense of resolution. And I think there is far more to be said in terms of the same things that Santim's talking about in terms of that kind of social constitution of identities, the idea of not just saying, we've tried to demystify the idea, we've tried to take off the veil and say, oh, well, this is just something that has been created by the colonizers. So there's something else that has to be said. And we have to think about the ways in which people will form certain kinds of political solidarities beyond this, and the ways also, which is really not being done within a lot of Anglophone Caribbean scholarship, the way that the political economy of racism is interested in continuing in this present day in justifying and continuing these kinds of divisions between different ethnic communities within the Anglophone Caribbean. So that becomes a very important question, if not quite as immediately urgent a question as it may be in the Middle East and Africa.
If I could just jump in, I mean, there is a civil war in Ethiopia right now, and we should probably take that seriously. And the civil war, in many ways, is articulated around the nationalities question. And again, when we talk about the nationalities question, we're talking about how different sort of ethnic groups imagine who they are and what their relationship should be to each other. And I think that the language of unity and, let's do away with ethnic identities ends up being an ethnic position as well, because there is no neutrality in any of this, which is, I think, what I was trying to get at as well in terms of what is the role of the intellectual, like to pretend to be neutral and so on, and this abstracted individual doesn't really work in this context, right? And to also to take on this position of like, well, let's just forget these ethnic identities and act like, we can just have some unitary state. I think ends up reproducing like dominant, hierarchies. So I think it's really important to pay attention to the ways in which these ethnic solidarities are also bottom-up processes and not just top-down processes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go to the chat for a moment. We've got a question that's prefaced with a bit of a preamble, which I'm going to, because we're down to, I think, our last 18 minutes. I won't read all of, but the question at the end is, can the left afford to address so little the literature on racial and colonial capitalism? And then there is some reference after that to C.L.R. James, Cedric Robinson, and W.E.B. Du Bois. So I have a feeling I know what you'll say in broad strokes there, but any particular thoughts? We're at a historical materialism conference. Is there a future for historical materialism without these writings on colonial and racial capitalism?
I mean, I would just say, sorry, Aaron, let me butt in a little bit. I mean, I think that if we're not centering Germany as the place that produces like Marxist theory, what we also need to take seriously is that there are places like Lebanon, like Addis Ababa, like Nairobi, like Johannesburg, there is a very rich Marxist and left literature that takes race and racial capitalism seriously, not always articulated as racial capitalism, but are grappling with these very complex questions of what is capitalism in the global South. So rather than ask the question of like, can the left afford to not take this seriously, there is a left in the global South that is asking these questions and has produced a vast literature, right? And they're doing their thing, right? And it seems to me that if we take something like the book that you just mentioned, David, or Fadi's work, or my own work, rethinking these left traditions and what they mean for the global South does seem to be a burgeoning research agenda that's happening all over the place. I see so much work nowadays that's really thinking about these revolutionary traditions in the global South. And so again, we need to think about, why are we, when we pose the question of the left, who are we centering? And maybe the center is Johannesburg, and again, not Montreal or even New York for that matter, right? So Aaron.
Well, certainly. I mean, the short answer to the question is most definitely, and I think that it's very exciting with the global reparations movement, the way in which I think there is a turn and a recentered interest within these books. So in other words, I'm hoping next year that I'm going to teach a course on Black political economy, in which many of these kinds of texts are going to be centered. But those kinds, a course in that may have been considered less of interest to students 5 or 10 years ago than it actually is now in terms of the ways in which these questions have become so stark. So yes, that we can say that. But I think though that there's a question of exactly how you are tracking a tradition and tracking the genealogy of a tradition. So for example, and I'll give you something completely different. I did a book, which is almost 10 years ago, a collection called Caribbean Cultural Thought from Plantation to Diaspora. And the whole idea of the collection between myself and my co-editor was thinking about the cultural thought of the Caribbean region because we were located in the cultural studies department. Neither of us were particularly into cultural studies as a discipline, okay? And we had a real problem with the idea, as was being presented on some levels at our university writ large, that cultural studies in the Caribbean was almost Birmingham School, Frankfurt School, add the Caribbean and stir. And the point that we were making in the collection is that there is a long tradition dating back to the 19th century of Caribbean cultural thought, long before there is actually something called cultural studies in Britain. And of course, this long tradition of Caribbean cultural thought was dealing with and addressing the question of race and diaspora as an intrinsic part of theorizing the nature of what you're doing. So somebody like the great Haitian anthropologist, John Price Mars, who fundamentally influenced Herskovits, he has a theory of diaspora because he's thinking about Vaudin in Haiti. And in order to think and theorize Vaudin in Haiti at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, he has, of course, to be thinking about diaspora. He has to think about the change and the metamorphosis of this religion from Africa, syncretizing and working with Catholicism in the New World to create something new. So when we did that collection, then it blows out of the water the nature of thinking about the cultural thought or cultural studies to take one of the many traditions of thought within the region as some kind of adjunct to something that has been created elsewhere. And I suggest that's something that we can do with many different traditions. So, I mean, does anyone still doubt that W.B. Du Bois is the most important 20th century American sociologist? I don't know that anybody still doubts that. Okay, so yes, there's a question.
Doubt that, Aaron.
Pardon me?
I said people still doubt that
somewhere. Ignorant people. As we would say, right. Ignorant people. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, so that in response. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So, Aaron, earlier you mentioned someone who was at York University for a very long time, influenced so many of us, Atu Sekiotu. And his most recent book is on the theme of left universalism. And he refers to it as an Afrocentric approach to universalism. And it seems to, what's interesting about both of your books is that there is what I'll describe as a very clear emancipatory ethos at work. Neither view, I think, tries to delineate a full political program, but there's an ethos, and it invokes freedom, solidarity, some notion of a universal emancipatory project, and so on. So as we sort of count down to our last 10 minutes or so, I'd like both of you to sort of speak to that overall question that Sekiotu raises of a left universalism that is not the old European universalism.
Santi?
Aaron, I'm gonna let you go first. That's a complicated question. So,
well, you don't
go for it.
No, huh?
Okay, I mean, I could say things. Let me try and say something. I mean, I do think that my book is written against a kind of literature that was coming out of African studies and post-colonial theory in the 90s and perhaps early 2000s that was much more concerned with glorifying the local and glorifying sort of custom and community. And I'm obviously I'm interested in community. I just talked about the nationalities question. I'm interested in communal identities, but I don't want to take those sort of communal identities as these like examples of some kind of indigenous thought that doesn't have a history that is imbricated with, histories of capitalism and so on, right? The book is very much, and that literature from the 90s and early 2000s, I think, when they talk about decolonization, they're also trying to resurrect certain kinds of local thinkers as an example of what decolonial thought can be. I mean, in the case of the Middle East, you get this kind of turn towards Islam and religious thinkers, as an example of decolonial thought. In the context of Ethiopia, the Coptic Church becomes some kind of repository of decolonial thought, without thinking about the church and its history in the nation state, and so on. So the book is, part of the method of the book is starting with the particular, but also showing how the particular is this kind of sediment of these complicated and longer histories that actually stretch out to the entire globe, right? And I think Benjamin actually has some line about you pull the universal out of the particular rather than, starting from an abstract universal. And I think my book is very much committed to doing that, or to following that instruction from Benjamin. So in that sense, there is this commitment to the universal, but the method is starting from the particular, and not starting from abstract universals. Aaron.
Okay, yeah. I would say three things. One, I think that one of the things I've been trying to illustrate in the book is that there are many of the great Caribbean thinkers embody radical cosmopolitan vision, okay? And I don't mean cosmopolitan in the Bucci sense of cosmopolitanism, which unfortunately is a dominant sense, but radical cosmopolitanism, which has been internationalist in its scope and vision, has seen the world as part of the conditions that they care about. And I do think that's one of the great contributions of Caribbean thought to humanity. I also do recall saying in the conclusion chapter of the book that I think that the Caribbean has to with a memory of, but not burdened by, the Grenada Revolution, find its way back to revolutionary socialism. Okay, rather than what has happened post the Grenada Revolution, in which socialism became this almost dirty word, in which you can speak about it, the left scattered or turned into technocratic managers. The people who are the former left, I guess everywhere, but the former left in the Caribbean, these are people spouting ideas that they would have denounced as apologists for global and local apartheid, 30 or 40 years ago, and they're now spouting those kinds of ideas. So I make that argument that if the Caribbean does not seek to engage with socialism again, then we are going to continue to live under conditions of neo-colonial predatory rule by the West until, until neoliberal globalization dispenses with even the fiction of national sovereignty that supposedly exists at the moment. The third thing, though, that I would like to say is that I think that within the field of study that has been perfected under the title of decolonial thought, and I have my own concerns or considerations about that, I think that there is a radical visioning of what it would mean to create and present what, to use Sylvia Wynter's language, would be the human after Western man. And I think that Caribbean thinkers and Caribbean people have contributed to that, but also should see themselves as an essential part of that journey. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would just add is that I do think that one of the reasons why I go back to the student movement in Ethiopia to think about the ideas that animated the revolution and sort of policy in Ethiopia afterwards is that I do think that the ways in which those students understood Marxist theory ultimately was very much technocratic, and I suppose part of my project then is to restage those questions and to be like, what if I you know, ask the same questions of that the student movement was asking, but with a different understanding of what Marxist theory can do. And the last part of my book is an attempt to like take that much more seriously. And so there is an attempt to resurrect or revive Marxist theory and to show its relevance to the Ethiopian context. At the end of the book, but also by thinking about its history and then circling back and thinking about the problems of Marxist theory in Ethiopia and in Africa. How can we rethink its relevancy for today? And I certainly the question of trying to be less technocratic and perhaps less empiricist. And I think Marxism itself has a critique of being overly empiricist in our approach. So yeah, there's an attempt to revive Marxism at the end of the book. So there's that. I just wanted to point that out. Mm-hmm.
There is, I think, one of the things I find interesting about the way each of your texts ends is that you've been both deeply engaged with projects that have, on their own original terms, failed. And yet you are, in a certain sense, ruminating within the ruins, convinced that there is still something to be critically salvaged, to be redeemed, that this is not simply a lost cause, that in fact there are profound ingredients of historical experience that need to be remembered, but also revisited critically. Santim, as you were saying, it is not an attempt to monumentalize tradition. And that's where that, the whole issue that I think both of you have been speaking to around this democratic mode of engagement and reflection is so important. So as we're counting down, I'm going to give you both a chance for final thoughts. But before we get there, first, let me again remind everybody that this panel has been recorded. It will be going up online soon, and we can spread the word that way. On behalf of both Aaron and Santim, I want to thank Historical Materialism Montreal for providing us with this venue. Also to thank Spectre Journal, which sponsored this panel. But most importantly, I want to urge members of the audience to read and engage these texts. Ethiopia in Theory and Beyond Coloniality really are fine examples of exactly the sort of historically materialist interrogations of these questions that I think we need. They're experimental, they're multidisciplinary, and they do have both a sense of ethical and political engagement that doesn't attempt to prescribe so much as to gesture towards possible futures. So, Santim, Aaron, last words before we sign off.
Sure. I'll go quickly. One thing that just occurred to me in the response, as I've said, my book is on C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter, threaded through, worked through. But towards the end of a chapter on Wynter, I actually speak about Wynter reading James and Wynter's three engagements of James and the three, who is the theorist that she's written on the most. But I ended my reflections on this with an interview that took place with her in 1999 by David Austin, in which he was pressing her about what's the most important thing about James's talk 10 years after James's death. And Wynter replies with this sentence that is incredible in its economy of meaning. She said, "It was his tremendous revindication of what it means to be human, which, by the way, is always put down in the bourgeois notion of man." Okay? And I thought, yes, that is it, okay? But that is James, but that is also Wynter, but that is also Caribbean thought at its best.
Lovely. Santim.
Oh, that's just beautiful. I don't know if I can top that. I think we should. I think we should leave it at that. Yeah, honestly. What was the? I was supposed to give you like final remarks or something. Is that what you wanted?
No, you want to end on that beautiful passage from Winter about James, and I think that's it. Both of you are writing for us about what the human could be, and that, in the final analysis, is why we should all be reading and engaging with your book. So, thank you to both of you. It's been a wonderful chat. I look forward to seeing you both soon, and thank you for our audience who also we hope will spread the word as this panel goes up online. And thanks finally to Historical Materialism Montreal.
Thank you, everybody. I really had a good time. It was really fun. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, David.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sun Team. Thank you, David.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Do we get to see each other after this, or
I think